So, hello everybody. Good morning, good day, and good evening, and a very warm welcome to our IHRM series. My name is Marianne Festing. I'm a professor of human resource management and intercultural leadership at ESCP Business School in Berlin. And today I have the big honor of being the moderator for this webinar. Given that this webinar series has been running for well over 3 years and has reached nearly 30 webinars by now, I guess that the majority of you already knows that this was the direct result of the COVID lockdown back in 2020, when the IHRM conference in Paris couldn't happen, and when we decided to go on with our academic exchange and create this international IHRM webinar series. So we started this with an amazing group of people, and I'm very proud to be part of that. So I would like to mention them. It's Mila Lazarova from Simon Fraser University in Canada. It's Elaine Farndale from Penn State. It's Miguel Olivas from Penn West in the US. Maja Vidovic from RIT Croatia, and Maral Muratbekova and myself, both working at ESCP Business School, but at different campuses in Paris and in Berlin. The recordings of all our previous webinars are hosted at our YouTube channel, and based on the number of views, these are really being viewed very often. So please have a look at them if you missed one of them, right? For today's webinar, we have the pleasure of hosting Günther Stahl as our speaker. And the title of today's webinar is Incorporating Social Responsibility and Sustainability into International IHRM Research. Günther Stahl is a very well-known professor of international management and the director of the Center of Sustainability, Transformation and Responsibility at Wirtschaftsuniversität in Wien, in Vienna. I pronounce it a little bit in German, right? So prior to joining Wirtschaftsuniversität Wien, he served for 9 years on the faculty of INSEAD and had various visiting appointments across the world. We all know Günther's research, and his research interests include grand societal challenges and their implications for international business, the cultural and institutional drivers of corporate responsibility and sustainability, sustainable human resource management, and global mobility and migration. Günther has published in leading academic journals, but his work has also been published by Forbes, by Wall Street Journal, and by the Financial Times. He was the winner of very prestigious awards, among them the Carolyn Dexter Award of the Academy of Management. And in addition to that, Günther is also a great teacher. So he won numerous awards for best teacher awards, and most probably this is also the reason why he has chosen the topic of today's webinar, right? So it's about teaching, as I said before, it's about teaching and the sustainable dimension of international human resource management. Before we dive in and before I give the word to Günther, please be aware that the chat has been disabled for the attendees, but instead, please use the Q&A option to post any questions, any thoughts, any reflections you might have during this event. And after Günther's talk, we will have time to ask him some questions, and I will moderate that. So now please sit back and listen to Günther's talk. And Günther, it's really a pleasure for me. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Marion. Greetings to everyone, wherever you may be in the world. I'm really delighted to be part of this webinar series and to have the opportunity to share with you some ideas on how to incorporate sustainability and corporate responsibility into the design and delivery of international IHRM courses, or more broadly, courses with a focus on people management. Most of my students in the MBA or executive MBA program do not have a background in HR or plan a career in HR, but almost all of them are in positions in which they have responsibility for managing people. This is why the focus of this webinar is very broadly on the role of people management, including leadership in promoting sustainability and corporate responsibility. Now, this is also the focus of a new chapter that my co-authors and I wrote for the 4th edition of the Global Challenge book, which came out earlier this year, and for which we developed new teaching material. And in this book, we take a general management perspective on people management rather than seeing it as a functional activity that is best left to the HR specialists. Because our experience is that, especially in an M&E context, issues regarding strategy, corporate culture, and people management are very closely intertwined. And I believe this is particularly the case for companies' sustainability efforts, as I talk about in a moment. Now, those of you who have taught courses at the intersection of sustainability, social responsibility, and people management will probably agree that this is a challenging subject to teach for a number of reasons. And doing it well, in my experience, requires answering 3 questions. Now, it's absolutely essential at the beginning of a course or a module, even if it's only a day or a half day, that you can devote to the subject to clarify the what and the why. So what are we talking about, and why does it matter, to make sure everyone is on the same page and there's a shared understanding of the terms sustainability and corporate responsibility or similar concepts, because these are buzzwords, right? They're constantly thrown around in business school classrooms and corporate boardrooms, or here World Economic Forum sessions, but there's a lot of conceptual ambiguity and confusion associated with these terms. They are sometimes used interchangeably, for example, as in responsible and sustainable investing. I still haven't figured out what the difference is between the two. Some use sustainability as a synonym for environmental responsibility, like Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, in his 2021 keynote address. Others consider corporate responsibility as the overarching construct that has certain sub-dimensions, economic, social, and environmental dimensions, similar to the triple bottom line metaphor, which has recently been complemented by the concept of ESG to complicate matters even more. Yet others use the term sustainability in a very, very broad sense, basically to refer to a wide range of issues that are relevant to making businesses more sustainable. So it's a bit of a mess conceptually, I would say, but much of the more recent literature has positioned sustainability as the overarching goal, and socially, environmentally, and economically responsible behavior, as well as good corporate governance, as the means to get there, right? And this is also how we conceptualize it in our book. For example, in the people management wheel, which serves as the organizing framework for the whole book, we consider sustainability as the overarching goal or desired outcome, and discuss a number of people management practices and guiding principles that can help companies become more sustainable. An example of a people management practice is diversity, equity, and inclusion practice. So we have a chapter devoted to that. An example of a guiding principle is, let's see, the need to understand and balance dualities such as short-term versus long-term, global versus local, maximizing shareholder value versus meeting the interests of a larger group of stakeholders, and then understanding the implication for people management. And this is also how I conceptualize it in my teaching. Now, in addition to clarifying the key concepts, another very important aspect of the what question is to choose the right framework, right? A conceptual framework that explains what sustainability entails and that can guide students' learning around what is needed to tackle global sustainability challenges. And ideally, the framework should be broad enough to capture the complex nature of sustainability. So it shouldn't be too narrow and simplistic. And it should be suitable for the topic and for the audience. Now, by suitable for the topic, I mean that, for instance, if you teach a session on how to support climate action through sustainable IHRM, you would probably choose a framework that focuses on the environmental dimension of sustainability. Now, this may sound very obvious, but just a few weeks ago, I attended a seminar on the green transition, I think was the title, where the presenters used the concept of shared value, basically, to make their points, which was a complete mismatch because the shared value concept says very little about environmental sustainability, right? Or for example, if you plan to discuss with the students issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or human rights, you would pick a framework that emphasizes the social dimension of sustainability. Or if you're discussing with these students issues related to corruption prevention, it should have a corporate governance element, right? And if you cover all of these dimensions in your course, it would probably make sense to use a very broad framework like the SDGs or the concept of ESG standards, right? So the choice of conceptual framework is mainly determined by the content focus of your course, but also the audience. I don't know what your experience is, but when I work with younger students, I use the SDG framework, not only because the icons are so nice and neat and colorful, but more importantly, because, you know, all students are familiar with it. And also there are online quizzes available that can be offered as a pre-course assignment and that students can take to test their knowledge of the SDGs and better understand interconnections among the SDGs. So they usually find it very helpful. When I work with executives, especially in the banking sector, I use the ESG framework because everyone working in the finance sector is very familiar with it. The CEOs talk about it all the time. They have likely signed the responsible banking principles. So you don't have to spend a lot of time in the classroom explaining what ESG is and why it's important. And just to give you an idea of how you can incorporate ESG principles into the design of courses, last year I taught a one-day session on responsible and irresponsible leadership. So that was part of a 4-day leadership program that I did for a large European bank. And you see in the morning session, the focus was on how companies or how banks can be a force for good, for example, by appointing ESG ambassadors who act as role models and promote the social and environmental dimensions of ESG throughout the bank, also in the foreign network banks. And in the afternoon session, the focus was more on governance issues. Corruption prevention is an important topic, obviously, for a bank with significant exposure to Eastern Europe. So a lot of the discussion was around that. And also, this program took place in early March last year, shortly after the invasion of Ukraine. So, of course, we had many discussions about whether or not to pull out of Ukraine, out of Russia in the wake of the war, which added a whole new dimension to the G aspect of ESG, the governance dimension. So there are lots of conceptual frameworks that can potentially be used for teaching purposes. The common denominator behind all of these frameworks is the recognition that corporations and their leaders have responsibilities that extend beyond making profits, that they need to balance the financial interests of the shareholders, which is covered here by the corporate governance dimension, with the needs of a much broader set of stakeholders, including society at large. And in our book, we discuss lots of examples of companies that illustrate that a growing number of business leaders are committing their companies to advancing the SDGs and tackling some of the most pressing global challenges. Companies like Danone, which is the world's largest profit with purpose corporation that has this legal status, or let's see, Unilever or Patagonia. So the usual suspects, right? Companies that have topped the lists of the world's most sustainable corporation for many years. Now, these are all useful illustrations, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you make these companies the focus of extended case discussions, because that would be a bit boring for students, because many of them are familiar with Patagonia's business model, what they have heard of Unilever's sustainable living plan. There's not much new there. So it's, I think, more interesting for students to discuss maybe lesser known companies, also more contemporary cases like Novozymes, for instance. There's a large biotech company headquartered in Denmark. The largest company, or first large company in the world, that crafted its entire corporate strategy and business model around the SDGs to maximize societal impact, also business impact, because the two go hand in hand. Or even companies such as Novo Nordisk, of course, but Schneider Electric. This is the opening case for chapter 14 of our book. Now, Schneider Electric doesn't sound like a very sexy case to discuss, but it's actually an amazing transformation success story from a company, from a producer of heavy machinery and transportation equipment to the world's leading provider of customized energy efficiency solutions. And it's also a very interesting case from a global management perspective. Schneider Electric's motto is the most local of global companies. So they have a highly localized approach to sustainability and social responsibility, unlike most multinationals, where it's much more centralized and standardized. And also very interesting, even inspiring for students, are cases of companies operating in problem industries that have managed to transform from being the source of global problems like climate change or environmental pollution to becoming part of the solution of these problems, right? I'm thinking of companies like Neste, the Finnish oil refining firm that for decades operated business almost inclusively focused on crude oil, and then completely reinvented themselves, redesigned the business model, and is now one of the pioneers in the renewable energy sector, the world leader in sustainable aviation fuel. And in all of these cases, all these transformation cases, people management played a key role. Obviously, you know, strong purpose-driven leadership at the top, but a basic HR practice such as investment in training and development, reskilling, attracting and retaining key talent, and so forth. as I'll talk about a little later. Now, all of this raises the why question. Why do companies engage in these activities, and why some even completely reinvent themselves to address pressing societal challenges? Now, this is a question that, in my experience, always comes up when you discuss these issues with students and executives, especially with executives. I recently had a debate with some executive MBA students, so I was asked to do a day on the SDGs and tackling grand societal challenges, and was sharing some examples of companies that have embedded the SDGs into their business strategies. And one of the students raised his hand and said, "I'm an entrepreneur, I have my own firm. Why should I give I apologize, but these were his words. Why should I care about the SDGs, right? I'm not Mother Teresa," he said. So basically his arguments were that it's not the responsibility of business or business leaders to save the planet, and that should be left to the nonprofit sector, the Mother Teresas of the world, and the politicians. And he was not alone with this opinion. Also, I have to say that it was a bit of a surprise that his comments generated a fair amount of backlash among the other students. But you need to address the why question, right? Because there are always skeptics or cynics. In my experience, the why question is fairly easy to answer for most of the governance issues of ESG. Also, the E dimension of ESG, environmental concerns, it's fairly obvious why companies or by executives should not engage in accounting fraud or discriminate against minorities or do other harmful things, because these activities are not only irresponsible and unsustainable, but they are also illegal in most countries, at least. And engaging in these harmful practices can have serious negative consequences for not only for these stakeholders, but also for the corporation, and in the worst case can kill a company. So everyone understands that. It's a bit harder to make a case for business as a driver of positive societal change, companies as a force for good, what we call the doing good dimension of corporate responsibility, because most of these activities are discretionary. They're not required by the law, sometimes not even expected by society. So it's not immediately obvious to most people why companies should engage in these activities. And this is why I always devote significant attention in my courses to the why question. And also in our book, we do this and discuss companies' motives for engaging in these activities. And there are many, but they tend to fall into these three broad categories. So compliance and risk management related, strategic, instrumental, and value or values-based motives. And it's usually a combination of different motives. Now, just to give one example that is closely related to people management, the top management team of a large multinational might promote a new diversity and inclusion program because it helps the company to protect it from lawsuits, discrimination lawsuits, for example, but also because it helps the company position itself as an employer of choice and to attract and retain top talent, for example, female talent, so the business case, or simply because top management considers it unacceptable to discriminate against minorities, so for values-based reasons. And again, it's usually a combination of these motives. Now, of course, statements like Ralph Larson's, the former CEO of Johnson & Johnson, who said in an interview that Johnson & Johnson would act in accordance with its broader societal mission, the famous Johnson & Johnson credo, even if it became a competitive disadvantage at some point, are often met with skepticism among students. They say, wow, it's great to hear that there are so many socially responsible companies out there and so many CEOs who put purpose over profit, but CEOs make these commitments all the time. Are they really walking the talk? And they are absolutely right. There's a lot of window dressing, a lot of greenwashing going on, or SDG washing, I think is what it's called today. Now, a glaring example is Volkswagen. This, by the way, is also a great teaching case. There's an INSEAD case about that. Also the people management implications. Now, Volkswagen was a member of the UN Global Compact until shortly after the scandal. And Volkswagen's core values include, believe it or not, let me read that from this page, social responsibility, sustainability, in the spirit of partnership. And the mission statement says, Volkswagen is more than an employer. We are responsible for people, the economy, society, and the environment. And it ends with the phrase, integrity is at the heart of everything we do. Now, it's hard not to become a cynic when you read that, but this often generates, a really good discussion. And when the discussion turns to window dressing, greenwashing, or even companies engaging in unethical practice, this is an excellent opportunity to engage students in a discussion of the dark side. So the reasons why companies and executives engage in this kind of irresponsible and sometimes even criminal behavior. And in my experience, students love that. They are much more interested in the dark side than the bright side. Instances of ethical conduct that makes them yawn, but they, as a rule, they have a very strong interest in these corporate scandals, psychopathic CEOs, and then you can have a discussion also about the underlying drivers at the individual, organizational, and societal levels. And you see that many of the organizational drivers are very closely related to people management, like misaligned incentive system, ethical climate, lack of ethical climate, toxic leaders, and so on. And then, engage the students in a discussion of how to prevent corporate wrongdoing and how you can create a strong ethical infrastructure. And again, it's all about people management. For example, designing compensation and benefit systems that link incentives to ethical conduct, instilling an ethical climate throughout the organization at all levels. Now, if you have only one session devoted to this topic, the dark side, you can naturally only scratch the surface and maybe provide some best practices and discuss also some of the macro level factors. But if you have a little more time, or maybe even a whole course dedicated to the role of people management in responsible and irresponsible behavior, here's a framework that you might find useful. It's a multi-dimensional, multi-stakeholder model of sustainable IHRM that I developed with 3 colleagues, Chris Brewster, Dave Collins, and Aida Jairo. And you see it's built around the 3 pillars of the triple bottom line, but for the new edition of our book, we adapted the framework and integrated the corporate governance dimension. So it's now the 4 dimensions that are covered. That allows us, for example, to discuss the role of human resource management practices in preventing value destruction and corrupt practices. And so this model illustrates how people management practices can contribute to 2 broad sets of objectives or activities aimed at enhancing societal well-being, like engagement in community involvement projects, for example, the use of corporate volunteerism programs. My friend Paolo Caligiuri has done very interesting research on that, or promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what we call the doing good dimension of sustainable IHRM, and activities aimed at avoiding harmful consequences for stakeholders and society at large in areas such as corruption prevention, environmental issues, human rights, and so on. So this is a framework that provides a basis for exploring both the bright side and the dark side, which is what I always do in my teaching, because especially in an M&E context, really both perspectives are important to address with the students. Certainly, we hear a lot about human rights violations in global supply chains and multinational companies engaging in corrupt or exploitative practices. And, there are tons of examples. For instance, Shell Nigeria or Nike's, child labor and sweatshop scandals, or Rana Plaza. So this is a very important perspective, obviously one that is very salient in the media, but what students often don't realize is that multinational companies can also be a force for good, right? So some of these companies are more powerful and more wealthy than many nation states, so they have the resources and also the capabilities to help tackle some of the pressing global challenges that we face, more so than the public and the non-profit sectors, probably. At least Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, argued this way. So let's see how much time I have left. I hope at least 5 minutes to address the how question, how to teach it. Now, we could easily spend a whole day discussing which pedagogical approaches and learning activities work. Unfortunately, we don't have the time. Therefore, let me take the remaining time to share with you some of the observations and experience from my own teaching, what has worked for me and what hasn't worked that well. Now, I have over the years developed a specific teaching philosophy or didactic approach, which I call 3-dimensional learning or 3D learning, that I use in many of my courses. Now, 3D learning boils down to the recognition that traditional classroom-based approaches to teaching sustainability and social responsibility, which basically aim mainly at imparting knowledge and building intellectual awareness among students through lectures, case studies, guest speakers, etc., are not enough to drive deep level learning. In order to make it stick and to drive real skill development, it's important to design learning activities inside and also outside the classroom that lead to learning also at the affective and behavioral level. For example, one interesting approach that I often use is the use of consciousness raising experiences, such as deep level immersion experiences or community service projects. This is something that I use in my SEMS master course. For example, students have the option to do a service, 1 or 2 days of service project, so social project. So they might look after homeless people or work with juvenile delinquents or drug addicts, or help refugees seeking asylum. Or another option is to deeply immerse themselves in an unfamiliar environment, for example, subculture within their own culture, could be the Sinti and Roma community, one of my students in the last course spent 2 days with Extinction Rebellion activists. So basically the objective is to give students an opportunities to stretch themselves beyond their existing boundaries by interacting with a group of people who differ in their world views, ethnicity, political views, and so on, to promote empathy, perspective-taking skills, also compassion, and maybe also cultivate servant leadership mindset in students. And these are all things that you cannot learn or teach in a traditional classroom setting. So it requires a different approach, what I call 3D learning. And in case you have an interest, I'd be happy to share with you an article in which Sebastian Reiche and I discuss how to incorporate these experiential elements into the design of courses. All right, before I wrap up, I would like to draw your attention to some useful resources, if I may. I mentioned earlier today that the 4th edition of the Global Challenge book, so we include a new chapter on promoting sustainability and social responsibility, and the teaching materials that we have developed and for the readers of our book, but I'm happy to share them with you, include lots of, I think, useful resources, including some exercises that we have designed here. This is, for example, group assignments. Students take on the role of consultants, advising the top management team of Shell on how to lead the company through the energy transition towards a more sustainable future, towards net zero, right? And they have to come up with a set of recommendations to the top management team on how to support this transition through leadership, people management, and organizational culture change. I've used this exercise a couple of times now with different audiences, and students are usually very engaged, and they come up with great ideas, and many of them related to people management, starting from employer branding, so how to position Shell as an employer of choice, which you can imagine is an almost impossible task, because who wants to work for an oil company these days? But they came up with some great ideas, for instance, how to create an attractive employee value proposition for Shell, one that is closely linked to their new sustainability strategy towards net zero, that this is actually something that could excite even the younger generation to become part of this transformation journey, similar to the Neste case. And basically all of the people management practices and guiding principles of the people management wheel can be applied to this case. Just to give you one example of an exercise that you could easily incorporate into your courses, and I'm very willing to share the case with you, including the instructions and required and recommended readings. The same is true for the PowerPoint presentations. They can be downloaded online, or I'm willing to share them with you. Yeah, if you have any questions or need some teaching ideas or advice, don't hesitate to contact me. Good. I'm afraid I'm already over time, but I don't know for sure. So I will stop here, and then we can move on to the question and answer. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much, Günther, for a very inspiring talk on how to teach or how to incorporate sustainability and social responsibility in our courses, especially in our international IHRM courses. I like very much that you went through the questions of what to teach, why to do that, and how to teach, right? And I think a lot of questions may evolve around that. And I'm looking at the chat, and it starts with some questions I would like to raise here. So the first question is, how can we incorporate social investment as a better alternative to corporate social responsibility in teaching and also in research? So it's a question by Samuel Barr.
Okay, let me just write this down. Corporate investment over. I've never really thought much about that, but I personally, I don't like to incorporate corporate social responsibility. I don't like the construct and actually never use it because many people associate it with window dressing, right? And people not walking the talk. Whereas, of course, investment involves a firm commitment, right? Which is something very different from just making commitments. But I don't teach finance, so I don't get into the details of social investment. In fact, in preparation for today's seminar, I did a bit of research. I didn't anticipate a question on, socially responsible or sustainable investment, but to read up on the recent literature, and I didn't find anything very substantial on that, the link to people management. So this is an underdeveloped area, I think.
Okay, so well spotted, I would say, right? And maybe more research and more work is needed for that. I have another question here, which is, how do we argument the idea that socially responsible companies have a social purpose while their main purpose is to make financial gains? So here we address the paradoxes, right, of at the same time pursuing social goals, financial goals, and if I may add, also environmental goals. And our audience would like to know, how do we argument that, right? The idea that socially responsible companies have a social purpose.
Yeah, well, first of all, we saw many examples of companies that illustrate that the two are not mutually exclusive, right? That you can be financially successful, economically successful, and be a force for good. And in fact, you can make that part of your business model, right? And very successfully so. And I think Unilever, right, is a classic example with its sustainable living plan, that Paul Polman launched, I think, 15 years ago. And they consistently delivered, a very good amount of returns to their shareholders. And try to tackle some of the most pressing global challenges like poverty, environmental degradation, and there are many other examples. Having said that, it's not that simple, and there are sometimes trade-offs, right? Like take for instance the situation facing companies operating in Russia, that have been struggling with the question of whether or not to pull out of Russia. And, for instance, there are some banks in the country where I'm now residing with very strong exposure to Russia. And they have decided to stay, right? Because that's one of those trade-offs. If that's your biggest market, you think twice before pulling out of this market. And I've actually discussed this with a senior executive of one of the largest bank, and he argued this way, because it's actually inconsistent with the ethics code of this company. And he said, you know, you have to be aware that we are not running a sausage stand, he said in Russia, but we're talking about a huge organization with thousands of employees, 10,000 of customers, and we also have a responsibility to our employees and customers in Russia. So these are really very tricky, that these cases raise very tricky ethical dilemmas, and as always with ethical dilemmas, there's no simple answer here, but there are these trade-offs too.
Thank you for elaborating on that.
And sorry, if I may just elaborate one more. And yeah, whenever you face, I think, such a trade-off or tricky dilemma, it's important to be aware that it sometimes pays to stick to your core values and you know, make decisions that affect the future of the company on ethical grounds, simply because it's the right thing to do, even if it harms your business and even if it has negative consequences for some stakeholders. I think this is what many companies had to learn the hard way.
Mm. Thank you very much for your perspective on that. I have a question which is a bit related. So it's the question about, do you think that research in corporate social responsibility, employee-centric strategies is interesting enough? I think you answered that already to a certain extent, but maybe you also have a perspective on researching. Would you recommend this employee-centric strategy, researching that in the context of CSR?
Can you clarify, Marion, what you mean by employee-centric strategy?
So I'm just referring to a question from the audience. My understanding is that there is a very strong focus on the social dimension. If this is employee-centric strategy, this is at least my understanding of this question. So is it enough to highlight the social dimension of corporate social responsibility? This is how I have read that. And in the question before, we raised these several goals, right? So how do you manage the interplay? So here the question is obviously, is it enough to look at the social dimension of corporate social responsibility?
I wouldn't say it's enough because you know, when you look at the HR literature, or also read Jeff Pfeffer's article in Journal of Management Studies, Why the Assholes Always Win, you know, he made a very interesting observation talking about the social dimension and HR research, namely that you know, of the most admired companies in the world, in the Fortune rankings, etc., there's only one company actually that made it on both the best companies to work for and the most admired companies rankings. In other words, many of the most successful and admired companies in the world, you know, don't care too much about their people. Right. Think about Amazon and Elon Musk Ventures and Apple and you name it. So talking about research, I thought, you know, that would be really an interesting thing to look into in research. Why is that the case, right? We like to think that companies that do a really great job and treat their employees well, and there are some classic teaching cases like Southwest Airlines, right? Then like Herb Kelly, the legendary CEO, said, you know, if you treat the employees well, they will treat the customer well, and then that will then lead to higher returns for the shareholders. Well, it's not quite as simple, right? And I think we need a lot more research on that too.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We now have some questions about the international dimension, right? And there is one, first of all, people, thank you for your great presentation. I would like to mention that as well. There is one question by Alexandra Barnard, and she obviously has read your original publication on the multi-stakeholder approach to sustainable IHRM. And she's asking for the special dimension, right? So is there already some knowledge on what would be best practices, how HR professionals in multinational corporations approach the topic of sustainability on a global level? So with really focus on this special dimension. So how do they manage the tensions, and how can they successfully involve also the subsidiaries?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I didn't have time in the end to present another very important framework that I often use. It's based on Bartlett and Goshal, you know, their model, and sort of illustrates how multinationals implement their sustainability CSR strategies globally, and some of the trade-offs they face and how they resolve, you know, these tensions when faced with very complex social, environmental, and governance issues. And basically, what you find is that some companies have a highly globally integrated approach, others a more locally adapted approach, and then there are some true transnationals, right, that try to be very responsive to local stakeholders, and at the same time, you know, have a globally standardized guidelines, policies, etc. I think when you look at companies, the interesting thing is that it's been changing over time, right? That they changed their globalization strategies with regard to sustainability and responsibilities. It's a long learning process for many companies. Like take for instance Shell. I talked about Shell earlier. As we know, Shell has been involved in lots of corporate scandals. Take Shell Nigeria. And Shell's policy had always been, until the 90s, that we don't interfere in the internal affairs of other nations, right? So, for instance, when operating in Nigeria, right, we just turn a blind eye to what is happening there. But then they quickly realized, after all these scandals erupted, that you can't do that. As a multinational operating in a country run by a military regime, right, and who executed Ken Saro-Wiwa, this activist there, you can't turn a blind eye to that, or all the human rights violations in the country, because if you do that, it completely destroys your reputation. And Shell never really recovered from that scandal. So they completely changed that, you know, and then moved to a more locally sensitive approach, I would say. So trying to better understand the local environment and also taking a stance. And when they realized that there are some countries where they can't operate, like Nigeria, they decided to divest the business there. So I think for many companies, it's a long learning process. Or IKEA actually took the opposite, where IKEA is normally a company known for their, you know, they've consistently been ranked among the most socially responsible and sustainable corporations, but they screwed up badly several times, like for instance in Saudi Arabia, when they erased all images of women from their Saudi catalog to please the local censors, not considering that this would, you know, lead to an outcry all over the world. So what they did as a result of that, they started to highly centralize, you know, these policies, guidelines regarding sustainability and corporate responsibility. So they went from a highly localized approach to a highly globalized approach, again, in response to these scandals. So there's a lot of learning going on there, I think, and also a lot of trial and error.
Thank you very much for addressing that and for also mentioning countries like Nigeria. And this leads me to the next question, which has been raised by Christoph Barmeyer. And his question is, don't we have a kind of ethnocentric way to look at the topic? And do you include in your research or consulting or teaching also the perspective of companies which come from other regions of the world, like from the global south? And he mentions India, he mentions Brazil, he mentions China. Do you also look at companies which have their origins there, and what is their perspective on sustainability or corporate social responsibility?
Yeah, I think, Christoph, that's an excellent question again. And I mean, we do have this tendency to apply Western concepts in management research in general, right? And also in research on sustainability and corporate responsibility. And we have to be a bit careful here. I just recently had this discussion, when I gave a presentation and talked about how to teach ethics, business ethics in a global context. And someone asked me, and what is the ethical foundation? Do you use Plato and Aristotle and Kant? And I said, yes, I do occasionally, but that's a very Western-centric approach. And I have Chinese, I have Indian, executives in my classes. And do they care a lot about what some, mall philosopher in Königsberg said 250 years ago? Probably not. So we also have to look at indigenous perspectives on ethics. Having said that, I think, a fair amount of ethnocentrism is important when running a global corporation. Ethnocentric in a way that you have your core values as a company, and you never ever compromise them at the local level, no matter how big the temptation is, to follow a do in Rome as in Roman. No, you know what I mean. Approach and to locally adapt too much. That's a very difficult, very risky thing to do when it comes to ethics, I think. I wouldn't necessarily call it an ethnocentric approach, but stick to your core values wherever you do business.
Thank you very much for this answer. We are already nearly at the end, and I have so many questions which I cannot ask, but maybe you have one short answer for a question about the how. And people would like to know where they can find more information about your 3D approach to teaching. So the cognitive, affective, and behavioral approach. Do you have a short recommendation where they can find information?
Yes, certainly. There's this Advances in Global Leadership article, an interview that Sebastian Reichert did with me, and where I provide lots of examples, how to achieve also this deep level learning gains at the affective level. And also, you don't have to do what I do in my SEMS course, like deep level immersion experience. You don't have to send your students to sub-Saharan Africa or the Amazonas Delta to provide them with these experiences. These are all things that you can do at the local level. So this article contains lots of examples.
Okay, thank you very much for this short answer, and thank you very much again for this great presentation. As I said, people applaud you in the Q&A also and say thank you very much for these great insights on how to teach this important topic. Before we close the seminar, I would like to make 3 announcements. And the first one is, of course, we go on with our webinar series. So in January 25, we have Maike Andresen from the University of Bamberg. and she will share her knowledge with us. And she has a very nice title, Wanderlust to Wonderland, Insights into the Research of the EU project Global Mobility of Employees, or shortly GLOMO. So if you're interested, you have the QR code here and you can already register for this next webinar. The second information, I would like to point your attention to the 6th Global Conference on International HR, again organized by the Center of International Human Resource Studies at Penn State. And this will take place in Sweden this time in June 13 and 14, 2024. So it's still time to submit your papers. The deadline is only in February, and it would be great to see you there. And the third announcement that I would like to make is there is a special issue by the International Journal of Human Resource Management, and it's about understanding strategic human resource management in the context of the Global South. And the deadline is as well in February. For now, thank you very much for attending this webinar. Thank you very much again, Günther. Thank you very much, the whole team which is behind this webinar series. We wish you a nice festive season and hope to see you again in January. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.